America and the Christian nation. Sometimes, in order to understand constitution law, we have to understand culture and broader definitions of who a people are, or what a state is, or what a nation is. And one of the most fundamental debates you'll see engaged in the United States is over what is the American nation. For me as an academic and intellectual, I've observed that the most generally agreed upon definition of the American nation are those values and virtues that are embodied in the Constitution itself. And we find that when we talk to people in politics and survey the public, this is generally the case. So as a consequence, one thing we often end up in is we end up in a fight over what that Constitution means, what the basis is of its origin. And in particular, we get into this fundamental argument that's very important to Americans because of a variety of debates we've had in this country for the last half century, which is America a Christian nation? Is there a Christian nation in America? And if so, does this give preferred position to Christianity in the legal and cultural and political order? Now, the thing about identifying any national identity is it can be a vexing thing. About 100 years ago, an American by the name of William Tyler Page wrote in a contest at the beginning of America's entry into World War I, a thing called the American Creed. It was later adopted into the record of the U.S. House of Representatives. And it was his effort to identify what is an American. And this definition of the American and the American national identity is strongly invested in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the notions of sovereignty, federalism, freedom, justice, egalitarianism, patriotism, truth, the American way. And it reads, "I believe in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed, a democracy and a republic, a sovereign nation of many sovereign states. A perfect union, one inseparable, established upon those principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity for which American patriots sacrifice their lives and fortunes. I therefore believe it is my duty to my country to love it, to support its Constitution, to obey its laws, to respect its flag, sorry, there's only one flag, and to defend it against all enemies." Now, this sounds pretty secular, okay? Very much rooted in the secular language of the American Constitution. But oddly enough, when you take a look at it, what you see is the invocation of a variety of institutions and traditions that it can be argued come out of the Protestant Christian descent that creates the United States. The thing we have to remember about the American Republic and the states that precede it and constitute it, which are inseparable parts of it, is that a sizable number of them start as Protestant dissident states or as Christian dissident states that are in dissent against the predominant Anglican faith, the Church of England. Georgia, my wife's home state, was founded in 1733. James Oglethorpe, the founder of that colony, which was a decidedly mercantile economic colony, argued to Parliament that Christianity will be expended by the execution of this design of this colony, since the good discipline established by society will reform the manner of those miserable objects found in America. A whole colony shall be had in a just, moral, and religious manner. Maryland was established as a predominantly Catholic state, Pennsylvania as a refuge for Quakers. Massachusetts, founded by Puritans and Baptists, Congregationalist in nature, as was all of New England except Rhode Island, which was founded as a place for dissidents from Puritanism. Religious order and morality was strongly integrated into the state order of many of these states, into the governing structure. So we have this long tradition for a century and a half in the United States before the founding and the framing of religiously infused governmental institutions. But oddly enough, religious infusion and the nature of the institutions didn't start there. It actually starts back in Tudor England under Henry and Elizabeth. The Tudor Constitution provided for a fundamental law superior to and limiting government. There was something bigger than government out there, natural law. The creation of efficient governmental designs, very, very, very Protestant concept, efficiency. And that when brought to North America, these become a vehicle for ensuring and protecting colonies that have dissident perspectives on the Protestant approach to Christian worship. Designed first and foremost to create a place where it leaves space for, to quote Samuel Huntington, one can learn God's truths directly from the Bible. That the creation of a secular government with a degree of efficiency and a degree of popular control was designed to protect religious freedom so that man could receive God's instruction directly and take it from the Bible himself. So we have this early tradition of this Protestant descent, a step away from hierarchical churches, from state-mandated churches, and the creation of a state that's simultaneously infused with Christian faith, but also designed to protect faith from government. This dichotomy that gets created is what continues to vex us in the debate over the American national identity. Huntington, as an aside, contended that starting in the 1960s, the decline of Protestant preeminence in the moral space of the United States was creating the great challenge, the continuity of the United States as a great power, and that only a return to the historic role of Protestant Christianity would shape those institutions, and the return of those values to the moral public space could save the American Republic. So we have a powerful argument coming from one of America's leading intellectuals who died just a couple of years ago, that these institutions that get created in part to protect free exercise need to be a vehicle to reinfuse the moral authority of Protestantism into the American public space. Now, another intellectual, Hugh Hecklow, argued at about the same time, this is all taking place around 2005, these arguments, that if you look at the question of whether or not America is a Christian nation, you get what's called the no but, yes but argument. That if we look at the demographics of the United States, 75% of Americans identify as being Christians, okay? So by a technical count, we have a nation of Christians, okay? When we ask people how they adhere, what their religious identity is, we have this overwhelming Christian nation. But then if you look at our laws, our state laws, our federal laws, our behaviors, and we survey people about their preferences and their behaviors, we don't see a nation that is taking moral guidance or from doctrinal creed of Christianity. That we don't see through most law implemented in the country the implementation of a Christian moral order. So as much as we have a nation of individuals who profess Christianity, we do not see in the structure, the explicit structure of constitutions or in most public law, moral guidance that is explicitly Christian. Nonetheless, Hecklow concedes, much as Samuel Huntington argued, that the Christian foundation of the creation of the American political tradition, our institutions, for that matter, the American political ethos, those values that we purport that we want to uphold, have got a strong foundation in Christianity and specifically in Protestant Christianity. But then Hecklow makes the most interesting argument, one that's personally intriguing to me. He argues that by definition, you cannot have an actual Christian nation. You cannot have an actual Protestant Christian nation because foundational to Christianity is the notion of individual calling. So the state can't be the vehicle for the establishment of a Christian nation, that Christianity by its very nature is something different and can't be the foundation for nation. But then Hecklow points out something that leads me to the core of what I want to, the point I want to make about the American Christian nation. He points out, and I will quote from his 2007 article, that we live in a time, which is not rare in our history, when a significant number of Americans regard being super patriotic and super Christian as the same thing. Pollsters find that today's conservative Protestants have more pride in America than any other religious or non-religious social group. Among the roughly 1/4 of Americans who belong to conservative Protestant churches, a large majority of whom are conservative white Protestants, 87% are self-identified evangelicals, they see America as founded on Christian principles. And most of these people think that Christian morality should be the law of the land. This is where the debate becomes engaged. The question, as framed by Hecklow, is this a Christian nation, is an empirical one based upon contemporary evidence. Actions of law, the structure of institutions, the identity of the public, and their behaviors. Is it a Christian nation? Those individuals who most often identify as Christian nationalists ask a different question. Should it be a Christian nation? Should the state be a vehicle for instituting the sort of preferred moral order that Samuel Huntington talked about? Now, what's peculiar about this is not a hypothetical, it's a return to origin. If we go back before 1960, one thing that we see, and this is something of all things we learn this from geographers, what we see is that majorities, and especially religious majorities, like to define control of their physical space. We also see that nationalist majorities, regardless of whether or not they're religious, want to define the national space. They take a piece of geography, they become the predominant group in that geography, and they attempt to define that space and make it their own. So one thing they seek to do is to craft policy, either through norm, practice, law, or constitutional order, to assert the primacy of their value set on their geography in order to protect the culture. It's a very, very common behavior, and oddly enough, it's one that we look at other nations around the world and we in fact respect and defend. Concepts of the notion of return. Okay. Historic claims to lands, self-determination. In the United States, and again this quotes Bert Carroll, an excellent geographer, Anglo-Protestant dominance and marginalizations of others remained an American fact of life into the 20th century and left a lasting imprint on American life. We don't talk about concepts like Judeo-Christianity in the United States until the 1950s. Okay? The definition of that space, the incursion for the first time after World War II of religious dissent, of racial dissent, challenges the foundation of moral Protestantism in the public square. It's simply assumed that Protestantism is normal and will dominate the public square. For the first time in the 1950s and 1960s, from World War II forward, this concept gets challenged in public life, and a Supreme Court exists that entertains and defends those challenges. That it cannot be simply taken for granted that the Christian normal, the Protestant normal, will have a claim to the public space and be able to use the state as a vehicle for the imposition of a particular moral order in public policy. But oddly enough, that practice is not unusual. It's common in human behavior to use the state to attempt to solidify that moral space. So who are the Christian nationalists, and why do they matter politically, and how will they affect the debate over the Constitution? When we survey people around the country, and I've done this survey work in Oklahoma most recently, we discover that a Christian nationalist is defined largely by agreement with the following statements. America holds a special place in God's plan. Okay. God has chosen this nation to lead the world. So these are concepts of manifest destiny, which are written into American history. And when we initially say the term manifest destiny, we think of it as being a historic secular concept. But in fact, it has a deeper spiritual religious origin. The U.S. is founded as a Christian nation, another term that they will generally agree with, overwhelmingly agree with. They'll argue that it's important to preserve the nation's religious heritage. Okay? And finally, strong agreement with these four statements is often associated with the belief that the Bible is the actual and literal Word of God. So biblical literalism and these statements of Christian nationalism among Americans usually go hand in hand. There are two statements they will strongly disagree with. One they will strongly disagree with, and one where they are not distinct from other Americans. They will disagree with the statement that U.S. success is not a reflection of divine will. Christian nationalists will not cleave to this statement. But what they will agree is that the U.S. was established to be religiously diverse. In practice, what we end up seeing is an effort to craft policy that allows for expression of religion in the public space, or to incorporate religious expression as one component of other aspects of culture and expression in the public space or through public institutions, which means that debates over free exercise and establishment get wrapped up in speech issues as well. We have a peculiar environment at work where, for the first time, we are seeing those individuals who profess to be Christian nationalists, who are disproportionately evangelical Christian, disproportionately Southern, actually more often than not, less rather than better educated, less rather than more affluent, making arguments for defense of space, demanding or supporting policy in defense of space, which means that we may see them engaged in actions that will be an attempt to simply assert or to articulate their values in the public space, that will be viewed as critics as being imposition, but being viewed as other advocates as merely public expression. And this is where the next great wave of litigation comes from, and it's actually currently underway around the United States and in places like Oklahoma in particular. 10 Commandments displays, which must be put in historic context, the use of religious expression and prayer by public officials in the conduct of public business. Because the courts have gotten into actively policing this line in detail, we find the courts will probably be perpetually infused in dealing with this issue, because this notion of Christian nation, this notion of Protestant foundation of the establishment of the country, is very difficult to disentangle from history. All right, thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.